What would you do if, after years of building an empire, someone looked you in the eye and told you, you're not worthy? It was supposed to be just another flight. A routine trip, a chance to catch up on work while gliding above the clouds. But for one man, a black CEO who had spent decades breaking barriers and commanding boardrooms, it turned into a moment that would test everything: patience, pride, and power. Imagine standing at the gate, holding a ticket that promises comfort, a first-class seat meant to honor your status, only to be told you can't board. 14 minutes later, the world above and below would watch as the tables turned in a way no one expected. The airline thought it was just a minor inconvenience, a rule to enforce, a seat to deny. But they hadn't counted on the quiet strength, the sharp mind, and the reputation of a man who doesn't accept being sidelined. Not in business, not in life, and certainly not in the air. By the time the clock hit 14 minutes, decisions would be made, flights would be grounded, and an entire company would learn a lesson they would never forget. This isn't just a story about a seat. It's about respect, power, and what happens when the underestimated refuses to stay in their place. It was early morning, just before the city woke up. The sky over the metropolitan skyline was a dull gray, thick clouds reflecting the muted chaos below. Streets were still damp from an overnight drizzle, and the faint smell of coffee and exhaust hung in the air. Inside the airport, a quiet hum of movement filled the terminals. Rolling suitcases, distant announcements, hushed conversations. But beneath it all, there was a strange stillness, as if the day itself was holding its breath. The check-in area was nearly empty, save for a handful of travelers who moved like shadows across polished floors. Fluorescent lights flickered softly, casting long, sharp reflections on the metal surfaces. Each step echoed in the near silence, every sigh and shuffle magnified in the vastness of the hall. It was the kind of atmosphere that makes you hyper-aware of every small action, every glance. At the gate, the man waited, calm, composed, but alert. His tailored suit was immaculate, briefcase in hand, a phone pressed against his ear intermittently as he coordinated the final details of his day. From the outside, he looked like any other executive, blending seamlessly into the crowd. But the quiet tension in the air seemed almost drawn to him, as if the airport itself sensed the storm about to unfold. Outside, the drizzle had begun to form tiny rivulets along the glass, blurring the outlines of planes lined up on the tarmac. A low hum of engines in the distance mixed with the occasional rattle of luggage carts, creating an undercurrent of restless energy. Travelers chatted quietly, unaware of the approaching confrontation, while the airline staff moved with mechanical efficiency, masks of politeness concealing impatience. Everything was ordinary. Everything was calm. Yet, within this calm, there was a subtle foreshadowing, an invisible thread of tension stretching from the gate to the sky. The stage was set. A simple denial at a first-class counter would soon escalate, rippling far beyond the walls of the terminal. The quiet before the storm, the pause that makes every sound sharper, every look heavier. It was a world poised on the edge of conflict, where respect, power, and patience were about to collide, and no one, not staff, not travelers, not even the CEO himself, could predict the fallout. He was easy to miss at first glance. Not because he lacked presence, but because he didn't feel the need to demand attention. The CEO, late 40s, sharp jawline, deep brown eyes that seemed to measure everything in an instant, moved with a quiet authority. Each step was deliberate, his posture straight, shoulders squared, exuding confidence that didn't shout but resonated. Even in a crowded terminal, people instinctively gave him space, as if some unspoken rule made room for his energy. His hands were steady as he adjusted his cufflinks, a subtle gesture that revealed years of discipline. He checked his watch, a luxury timepiece worn like armor, and made a note in his leather-bound planner. Every detail mattered to him: timing, precision, respect. Yet, there was warmth in his gestures too. A brief nod to a young traveler struggling with luggage, a polite thank you to the gate attendant, a reassuring glance at a colleague. Power, he knew, was measured not only by control but by how quietly it was commanded. Across the counter, the airline manager was the picture of corporate composure, tight-lipped, uniform crisp, and eyes trained on protocol. She spoke in clipped sentences, each word deliberate, as though memorized from a manual. There was efficiency in her movements, but beneath the surface, a rigid sense of authority pulsed. She ruled her domain behind the desk, controlling boarding passes and seating charts with an almost militaristic precision. Yet, she underestimated the CEO. Her rules were absolute, but her perception of power was narrow, confined to the boundaries of policy rather than human judgment. Then there were the staff, assistants, gate agents, flight crew, each moving through the terminal like clockwork, professional yet distant. Some glanced at him with recognition, some with indifference. In their eyes, he was a passenger. In reality, he was a disruptor, a man whose reputation stretched far beyond the walls of the airport. They didn't yet know the storm he carried in his calm demeanor. Even fellow travelers played their role in the unfolding scene. Some cast curious glances, sensing tension without understanding its source. A businessman nervously fidgeted with his briefcase. A young mother whispered to her child, eyes flicking to the subtle standoff unfolding near the counter. The terminal was a chessboard, every person a piece moving unknowingly toward a critical move that would change the game entirely. Through these introductions, the dynamics were clear. Authority, respect, discipline, and pride, all compressed into a few square feet of waiting space. And as the CEO approached the counter, the tension between policy and presence, arrogance and quiet command, patience and provocation, was ready to snap. The moment came quietly, almost imperceptibly. The CEO approached the gate counter, briefcase in hand, steps measured, exuding calm authority. The airline manager glanced up, her eyes scanning his ticket, her lips pressing into a thin line. At first, it seemed routine, another passenger, another boarding pass. But then came the words that would ignite the day. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her tone polite but firm. "First class is fully booked. You'll need to take the next available seat in economy." For a heartbeat, he simply stared, not with anger, but with a piercing calm that unsettled the entire terminal. The bustling noise seemed to shrink, folding around the two of them. There were no dramatics yet, no raised voices, but something in his posture, in the subtle tightening of his jaw, spoke louder than words ever could. "I believe there's been a mistake," he replied, his voice steady, precise, carrying the weight of decades spent commanding boardrooms. "I have a confirmed first-class ticket. Please check again." She shuffled papers, fingers brushing against laminated lists, her eyes darting down and back up. "Sir, our records are clear. There's no seat available under your name in first class." He leaned slightly forward, not aggressively, but in a way that demanded attention. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the faint rolling of luggage wheels and distant overhead announcements. Every gesture mattered, his calm insistence, her rigid adherence to policy, the subtle tightening of her hands around the counter's edge. Nearby, travelers began to sense the tension. A young couple paused mid-conversation. A businessman tapped his pen nervously. Even the airline staff held their breath. No one spoke, yet everyone knew something important was unfolding. "I'm not asking," he said, voice low but unwavering. "I'm stating a fact. I have a valid ticket for first class. You will honor it." The manager's eyes flickered, a micro-expression betraying uncertainty behind her professional mask. She opened the system again, fingers flying over the keyboard, tension rising in the tiny movements of her shoulders. I don't see anything. Sir, I'm telling you, there's no seat." For a moment, the world seemed to pause. His calm demeanor was not a weakness. It was a storm contained in silence. A few seconds passed, yet it felt like hours. Every inch of his body radiated authority and control. And then, subtly, the first ripple of challenge, the faintest lift of an eyebrow, the quietest shift in weight, signaled that this was no longer a matter of policy. The inciting spark had been struck. What began as a simple denial of a seat had now morphed into a test of respect, patience, and power. And in that quiet, almost cinematic standoff, it was clear, neither would back down. The storm was no longer hypothetical. It had begun. The terminal seemed to hold its breath. Every eye subtly drawn to the quiet storm unfolding at Gate 42, where authority and arrogance collided like two unstoppable forces. The CEO's voice remained calm, measured, almost hypnotic in its steadiness, while the airline manager's clipped tone grew sharper, more insistent, trying to mask the crack forming in her composure. "You're mistaken," she said, her voice rising slightly, just enough to pierce the low hum of the terminal. "First class is full. There's nothing I can do." He paused, letting her words linger in the air. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean aggressively over the counter. He didn't need to. The quiet intensity of his presence did the work for him. Every inch of him spoke authority. Shoulders squared, hands relaxed but purposeful, eyes locked on hers with a patience that was almost painful. He was not threatening. He was undeniable. "Let me make it simple," he said slowly, each word deliberate, each syllable carrying weight. "I have paid for a first-class seat. This isn't a favor. It's a contract. A commitment. You can either honor it, or you can face the consequences." A flicker of hesitation crossed her face. In her career, she had enforced rules, managed conflicts, and ensured operations ran smoothly, but she had never faced someone who wielded quiet power like this. The terminal's usual rhythm, the low hum of conversations, the rolling of luggage, the faint beeps of check-in kiosks, seemed to slow around them, as if the world was waiting to see which force would prevail. The surrounding staff watched carefully, sensing the shift before it fully arrived. The balance of authority was tilting, almost imperceptibly at first, but unmistakably. She typed furiously, trying to reaffirm control, but every keystroke was a reminder that procedure alone could not contain this moment. Then came the ripple of accountability. He produced documentation, calm, unshakable, a ledger of his rights as a passenger. "Check again. I expect a solution, not excuses." His words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. The confidence behind them was deafening. The manager's jaw tightened. Her eyes darted toward her colleagues, as if looking for reinforcement, but the staff held their positions, silent witnesses to the unfolding lesson. The CEO's quiet insistence began to crack the armor of authority she had relied upon. Policy, she realized, could be questioned. Ego, she discovered, could be challenged. Control, she understood, was fragile when met with integrity and unwavering self-assurance. Every movement now became meaningful. The CEO's hand rested lightly on his briefcase, a subtle anchor to his composure. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, signaling that patience was part of his strategy, and that his presence alone was enough to recalibrate the power dynamic. The manager's fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitation replacing certainty. For the first time, she considered the human factor beyond the system. Other travelers had begun to notice. Whispers spread, curiosity mixing with admiration. A young woman recorded the exchange discreetly on her phone. A businessman leaned back in his chair, shaking his head at the quiet audacity of what he was witnessing. Respect, it seemed, had a gravity stronger than fear, and the CEO radiated it effortlessly. Then, in a subtle but undeniable gesture, the manager's shoulders sagged, eyes dropping, voice softening. The unspoken acknowledgement of a shift, the realization that authority grounded solely in position could be challenged by presence, preparation, and dignity, marked the turning point. It wasn't anger that defeated her. It was the undeniable truth of accountability. Within 14 minutes of what started as a minor confrontation, the ripple effects were unstoppable. Flights were delayed, policies reconsidered, and an entire operation forced to acknowledge the weight of respect over protocol. The CEO didn't raise a hand, didn't yell, didn't humiliate. He simply stood, calm, deliberate, impactful, a living reminder that power, when wielded with integrity and precision, could turn the world on its axis without a single shout. The terminal slowly returned to motion, but the echo of that confrontation lingered in every glance, every whispered conversation. Authority had been tested. Ego had been tempered. And the lesson was clear. Respect is earned, power is felt, and sometimes, the quietest man in the room can move mountains. For a long moment, neither spoke. The air between them was charged, thick with unspoken tension, as if the entire terminal had paused to witness a lesson in authority and respect. The CEO didn't raise his voice. He didn't flare with anger. He simply exhaled slowly, letting the quiet strength in his posture and gaze do the work no words could convey. The airline manager, once unwavering in her rigid adherence to policy, now felt the weight of the situation pressing against her. Every rule she had memorized, every protocol she had enforced, seemed suddenly small, inadequate, and hollow in the face of this calm defiance. She realized that authority grounded in position alone was fragile, especially when confronted with integrity, preparation, and unwavering self-respect. A subtle shift passed over her face, her jaw relaxed, eyes softening, and shoulders sagging ever so slightly. It was the moment she understood. The man before her was not merely a passenger. He was a person whose presence commanded recognition, whose patience was a weapon sharper than any raised voice. In that instant, the dynamic changed. The balance of power, once so clear, now tilted unmistakably. Other travelers sensed it too. Whispers spread like ripples across the terminal. The CEO's quiet authority had pierced the hum of routine, cutting through arrogance and indifference. It was not about the seat anymore. It was about respect, integrity, and accountability. The realization struck the manager fully. Her role was not to enforce ego, but to honor fairness. A simple acknowledgement, a nod, a shift in tone. These became more powerful than any policy she could cite. For the first time, she recognized that the true measure of power lay not in control, but in the ability to act justly when confronted by someone who refused to be sidelined. In those seconds, the story pivoted. The conflict, once a mere denial of a seat, became a testament to quiet strength and unwavering dignity. And in that subtle, cinematic pause, it became clear to everyone watching. True authority is not demanded. It is felt, it is earned, and it can change the rules of the game without a single shout. The terminal slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but the echoes of what had just unfolded lingered in the air. Travelers resumed their paths, rolling luggage over polished floors, yet glances lingered toward Gate 42, as if seeking reassurance that what they had witnessed was real. The confrontation had ended, but the impact rippled far beyond the boarding area. The airline manager stood behind the counter, reviewing her notes in silence. No one spoke, yet the unspoken acknowledgement hung heavily between them. Policies were written, but respect was earned. She had been forced to reckon with a simple truth. Authority without integrity was fragile, and ego unchecked could crumble under the weight of quiet strength. The CEO, calm as ever, collected his belongings and walked toward the boarding gate, each step measured, deliberate, carrying the subtle gravity of someone who had already won, not through force, but through dignity and preparation. There were no raised voices, no dramatic outbursts. Just the unmistakable clarity of someone whose presence had shifted an entire environment. By the time he reached his seat in first class, the ripple effects had begun. Flights were delayed, communications were sent, and internal memos circulated quickly throughout the airline. Staff discussed the incident quietly, aware that the rules they had followed blindly had been challenged, and in that challenge, a lesson had been delivered. Accountability, they realized, was not optional. It was inevitable. Outside the airport, the story spread. Travelers recounted it on social media, recording the subtle but powerful exchange. Journalists picked up on the narrative, not because of confrontation, but because of calm authority and unshakable integrity. The CEO did not seek headlines. He did not boast. His victory was quiet, internal, yet unmistakably transformative for those who witnessed it. And for the airline, the consequence was clear. Systems alone could not replace judgment. Policy without empathy could falter. A single moment of calm defiance had shifted perception, grounded arrogance, and reminded an entire organization that respect could not be bypassed. By the time the plane lifted into the sky, the terminal had resumed its ordinary pace, but everyone who had been present carried the memory of that encounter. It was a lesson in restraint, in the power of presence over volume, and in the moral weight of integrity. Justice had been served, not through revenge or spectacle, but through quiet, deliberate action, a victory measured not by noise, but by truth. In the end, the CEO leaned back in his first-class seat, a faint smile crossing his face. Not because he had won in the conventional sense, but because he had stayed true to himself, upheld his dignity, and, without a single raised voice, reminded the world that power is most potent when it is calm, measured, and unshakable. In the quiet aftermath, the lesson lingered far beyond the terminal walls. Authority is not measured by the volume of your voice or the rigidity of your rules. It is measured by integrity, presence, and the courage to stand firm when challenged. True power does not seek to dominate. It compels respect through calm certainty, not through fear or spectacle. For the CEO, victory was never about revenge, headlines, or proving a point. It was about upholding dignity, honoring the truth, and letting quiet strength speak louder than any policy could. And for everyone who witnessed the encounter, the lesson was clear. Respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned. Accountability is not optional. It is inevitable. Sometimes, the smallest acts of defiance, carried out with composure and conviction, have the power to reshape systems, challenge assumptions, and leave a lasting mark. In the end, the story reminds us that integrity is the ultimate authority, and quiet strength can move mountains where arrogance falters. Power wielded with respect changes the world. Authority without empathy collapses under its own weight.